Institute, we offer a range of programs from undergraduate through to professional education. Now, in the spring of 22, we offered and launched a redesigned MS in engineering management, and that leverages the best of our award-winning on-campus and online MSEM programs, and it's revisioned into a single top-tier graduate program that prepares leaders for the new world of work. Not only does the Tufts MSEM develop relevant content and practical skills that you need to thrive in an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world, but it also provides you with an exceptional part-time graduate experience that you can fit into your busy life. Now, MS in innovation and management, it's a full-time accelerated program designed for people who want to make things happen, passionate about science, technology, engineering, or math, who believe new solutions can solve our toughest challenges and make this a better world. If you're a recent STEM graduate who wants to accelerate your career and be at the forefront of developing new ideas, then the MSIM program will provide you with the product innovation, marketing, finance, and leadership skills you need to be a new leader in today's technology-driven world. And at this point, I would just like to invite my colleague, Tom Rosenberger, who is Assistant Dean and Director of Online Programs at Albany Law School, just to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Will. So Albany Law School is proud to partner on this event today with the Gordon Institute, and to have among today's panelists a member of our practitioner faculty and two of our graduate school alumni, all from our online graduate program in cybersecurity and data privacy, which is one of 5 highly practical and industry-focused online graduate programs that we offer, and we offer them to both lawyers and other professionals across industries and government. In addition to the program I already mentioned, we offer comprehensive programming in financial compliance and risk management, government affairs and advocacy, health law and healthcare compliance, as well as human resources, law, leadership, and policy. All of these programs have gained a national reputation for excellence because we teach all of our courses through a legal lens, as a law school should. And this is a needed skill set across organizations for those with or without any prior legal background. We offer 6 start dates per year, flexible pacing, scholarship opportunities for most applicants, and the chance to become a member of the Albany Law School Alumni Network, which dates back to 1851. So I just want to thank the panelists from Albany Law School for their participation in today's event, and of course, the Gordon Institute for the opportunity to be involved. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks for joining us today. So just a few words on the format of the event. In a moment, I'm going to call upon each of the panelists in turn to make about a 3 to 5 minute pitch, either for or against the motion under discussion. In a moment, I'll introduce those panelists. Then around about 1 o'clock Eastern time, we'll start a discussion amongst the panelists themselves. We would like, however, to include some questions from the audience. So we're not going to be able to include all of them, but if you have a question for the panel, please, if you could post them into the Q&A section. Now, I'll just briefly introduce the panelists, but my colleague Teresa is going to be posting the more detailed bios into the chat for you in PDF. So we have Lydia Brown joining us. We have Nada Bazikri. We have Noah Cook-Dubbin. We have Terence Jackson, Susan Landau, and Tony Ogden. Panelists, if I could just invite you to turn on your cameras. Now, panelists, can I remind you that we have an informed and interested audience here today, but not everybody is a specialist in the field of data privacy, and so if you mention some industry terms and concepts that you think might be unfamiliar, to this general audience, then I'd be grateful if you could give perhaps a further explanation or definition to aid that understanding. But in order in which you are on my screen, Terence, would you like to get us started?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to great, conversation today. And I would argue that we definitely have given privacy for convenience. We live in a world of roughly 8 billion, people, where 5 billion of those individuals have internet access, and there are 5.3 billion mobile devices and 4.6 billion social media users. So if you just think about those numbers and statistics, they're mind-boggling. And one of the ones that really sticks out there are more mobile devices than there are internet users. Or so think about that for a minute. But I always give a simple example, and I went shopping one day. And when I went to check out, the cashier asked me if I would provide my email address in exchange for a 10% discount. And I think that's a good, perspective on how important our personal data is to, in this particular instance, a retail company that's willing to give a discount off of a product for access to my personal information. So I, again, dare to say we have absolutely traded privacy for convenience. Some of you are probably sitting in the arm's reach of your cell phone or smart home device that has a microphone that's always listening, and the convenience of having that device to be able to perform functions and commands at will versus not. We've made a choice, albeit conscious or unconscious, of the privacy implications, but we have chosen to prioritize convenience over privacy.
All righty. Thanks, Terence. Nada.
Hi there, I'm Nada Vasakri. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to be joining. Just by way of quick intro, I'm Assistant General Counsel with Robinhood and also an adjunct professor with Albany Law School. As for our discussion today and the big question about whether we've lost the battle for privacy, maybe at risk of sounding optimistic, I don't think we have quite yet. I think in recent years, we've seen an emergence of legal frameworks around the globe that are starting to address how organizations process personal data, that have expanded individual rights, and that have introduced guardrails for how personal data should be handled more broadly. Does that mean we are perhaps in an ideal state from the consumer lens? Not quite yet. I think there's certainly lots to achieve, and there are opportunities to close kind of those gaps for what individuals and consumers ought to be expecting and seeing out of organizations when personal data is handled. And there's also questions about, beyond the law and regulations that deal with how personal data can be handled. Beneath all of that, kind of the economic incentives that have created an appetite in the private sector for data consumption to begin with, that has led to this state of affairs where maybe folks, to Terence's point, are trading in some of their privacy for convenience. There are some of those economic considerations below the surface that, to the extent we address them, maybe we move closer to winning this battle overall. But I'm not quite ready to throw in the towel yet. I don't think we've lost, and there is a lot of progress. Still a lot to come, though, in the way of an ideal state for consumers.
Thanks, Nada. Tony, would you like to give us your 3 to 5 minute pitch?
Sure. Thank you very much, Will, for the opportunity to be here today, and to Tom Rosenberger too. Really appreciate it, especially to be amongst such a group of expert panelists too. I feel very honored to be here. Have we lost the battle? Maybe it's because Nada was my first professor at Albany Law School's LLM program, but I too am an eternal optimist, and I don't think we've lost the battle. Rather, I think what has transpired over the course of the last several years is a better understanding of what the fight actually is. And I think I would highlight three particular areas why I remain somewhat optimistic and why I'm seeing an evolution towards a greater enlightenment around data privacy. One has to do with the attention at the state level. Obviously, GDPR on the, in the international front has led the way, and now several states, California, Oregon, Virginia, Connecticut, Utah, have enacted privacy laws modeled largely after the GDPR. And there's a growing demand and a growing evidence that other states are looking at enacting, state legislative initiatives to actually address data privacy. And at least 5 states currently are considering children's privacy-related legislation, while other states are also taking a look at the children's, introducing legislation that is will help protect privacy. So at the state level, the second would be at the federal level. While the US is woefully lagging other countries and states when it comes to protecting the data of its citizens, the last Congress did actually see the introduction of the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, the ADPPA. And it's pretty much the most meaningful bipartisan effort we've seen to address privacy at the federal level. And I'm an advocate for a privacy solution, but I am not confident that this current Congress, or that we're going to see anything happen potentially at the federal level in this particular Congress, or at least for the next 2 years. But so don't forget the regulators. I mean, we can't just look at the legislators, we have to look at the regulators. And I think in the absence of a comprehensive federal law, you're seeing a lot of activity by federal and state regulators around consumer data and privacy. Consider the FTC's proposed, commercial surveillance and data privacy rulemaking that they're looking at right now. It's a significant undertaking, but the FTC is, beginning to exercise its authority to protect consumers' data privacy, and also to foster some predictability and, for companies and for people alike. So I coined the term, I like the term of regulatory prescience. Pay attention to what's happening in the regulatory environment, because I think the regulatory environment portends a lot of what we're going to see coming down the road. And there's a lot of activity, not only here in the US, the FTC, the SEC, but also take a look what's happening within the EU with the privacy regulators there. And third and finally, consumers, I think, are gaining awareness and demanding more privacy protection. So clearly, as technology improves and evolves, consumers are, understanding more about what data they are giving up and how they can learn to protect it. I think Apple has been, on the forefront of kind of advancing privacy protections for consumers. And, that's allowing, I think there's much more conversation happening at the consumer level. So there's a greater understanding. So, while there's lots of reasons to suggest we've lost the battle, and I think that, even the poll that you put out, Will, had indicated that the majority of people think we've lost the battle. I again, remain optimistic. We may be kind of losing the battle. I think we're going to win the war on this one. So.
Thanks, Tony. I'm glad you mentioned the poll. The one that we ran on LinkedIn got a good response to it. But as you suggested, to the question, have we lost the battle in terms of data privacy and protection? 78% said yes, and a mere 22% said no. And just to make sure that we're validating that data, I'm just going to quickly, Noah, before I introduce you and ask you to make your pitch, I'm just going to launch a very quick poll as well, and we'll see if we can replicate that response, just to see what this particular audience thinks. So it's almost neck and neck. This is really rather exciting, isn't it? 51 to 49, 51 to 48. Yes, edging out in front at the moment. Who is going to win? Any more votes? All righty, we will end the poll at 53% saying yes and 47% saying no. So a slightly tighter margin than what we saw on LinkedIn. I don't know whether that is a reflection of this particular audience. Thanks everybody who voted on that. Noah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry it wouldn't let me vote in the poll. Otherwise, I would have voted maybe. My name is Noah Cook-Dubin. I'm the founder and principal of Kanoa Consulting, which is a strategic and creative marketing consultancy based in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Prior to starting Kanoa in 2019, I worked for 12 years at Google in California and in São Paulo, Brazil, most recently as creative director where I helped Google's advertising clients to create more interesting and effective ads using a wide variety of Google's products, technologies, and yes, data. And as someone who in some respect has made a living by commercializing user data, but while also holding very clear ethical and even spiritual views about that, my view is that many, many, many battles for data privacy have already been lost, but the war has not. For anyone who's been using the internet and internet-based services up till today, it's pretty hard to see how we can ever get the cat back in the bag. You know, our every digital step has been and continues to be tracked, cataloged, packaged, bought, and sold, held in a variety of databases by a variety of companies, many of which we've never heard of. Right? So no matter what we do now, we're looking at 20 or more years of the data that I've been shedding online. It's out there somewhere, and it is probably available for purchase and not for very much money either. Each of our ISPs, our internet service providers, they've got a ton of data about what we do. And you can bet that incognito mode affects that not at all, right? The manufacturers of our devices have sensor data, biometric data, our real-time location data, right? Keystrokes going into our devices. The providers of web analytics for the sites and apps that we use, the companies that run ad networks, the creators of the apps on our phones, and even a bunch of random companies that most of us have never heard of who create the building blocks of apps that are used by innumerable other app creators. They all have access to our data today, not to mention all the data that we shed in the past. And by the way, all of these entities have been hacked or compromised in some way, right? Meanwhile, the regulatory framework out there, especially in the US at a federal level, it continues to fail us, in my view, when it comes to protecting our privacy. And even in states like California, Virginia, Oregon, I believe, that have enacted some legislation, many are seen in large part as simply codifying the needs of the large corporations that operate there to continue business as they would like. Especially in the US, there's pretty broad agreement that regulation needs to be extended and modernized. Some of the regulations that are being weighed currently, like those that Tony actually mentioned, those would be a really good set of first steps to getting ourselves on the road to data privacy and security, but they're just the beginning. So when it comes to my private data and yours, I regret to inform you that we have already lost so many battles and the cat is already completely out of the bag. However, though we've lost a lot of battles, the war has not been lost, especially for those people like my kids who have not been digitally active over these past couple decades. In my view, the main battlefields that we're looking at now in the coming years are regulation, culture and education, and standards. Now, on regulation, it's pretty clear what my views are. I think we need to really modernize and stop using regulations that were written in some cases a century ago to dictate what's happening in a digital world. When it comes to culture and education, I think the prevailing ethos around innovation and growth really needs to shift to one that demands more ethical behavior by corporations and really punishes in a meaningful way corporate malfeasance. Education of future business leaders needs to focus as much on the safety and well-being of consumers as it does on how companies can grow revenue, which is one reason why I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to participate today. I feel really good about the Tufts Gordon Institute and what I see this institute putting out into the world in this regard. With regard to standards, I think we need new ways of packaging and controlling our data. We need new standards that simplify consumers' understanding of what data we're actually sharing, how it's going to be used, and we need to simplify the process of agreeing or declining to share that data, right? Having each site have a little pop-up at the bottom that says, will you give us your cookies, right? That's pretty onerous and it's not effective, right? So all of that needs to be simplified. Having this understanding and control should not require higher level intelligence or a lot of time or a lot of patience on the part of consumers. If we, as societies, can make these very profound, not trivial shifts in the area of regulation, culture and education, and standards, it's my belief that the war for our data privacy can indeed be won, but it's a long road.
Thank you, Noah. I think as far as cats being let out of the bag, I think it was Tony, because I keep seeing a little shadow behind you of a cat and its tail. So I'm waiting for that to appear. Susan, would you like to give us your pitch?
Sure. So I'm Susan Landau. I'm at the Fletcher School in the School of Engineering at Tufts. I am the founding director of our Masters in Cybersecurity and Public Policy. Before I did that, I had many different jobs. I'm one way to describe me is as someone who just can't keep a position, but I did keep a position at Sun Microsystems for 11 years till the company folded. Then I was at various places, including Google briefly as a senior staff privacy analyst, and I've been at Tufts for the last half dozen years. On privacy, is the war won or lost? Yes, which is the same thing I said to Google when I was working there. And I obviously intersected sometime with Noah, although we didn't meet. I want to focus on a slightly different place than everybody else is talking about. I want to look at the data we're not conscious of giving up, and Noah alluded to some of that already. So when you type in a search term to a search engine, or when you type in a location to a map, you know what data you're giving in. But when you send an email, you're largely not aware of who is picking up the IP address, the address of where you currently are. So it is not just your mail provider, but it's the ISPs that transit the mail. You're not aware, for example, that if you're doing a voice over IP communication, the packet length may reveal the language you're speaking. It may even reveal the words you're saying, even though the communication is encrypted. You're probably not aware that your phone, this device that for most of you is sitting in your pocket from 7 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. at night or 11 p.m. at night, this device transmits all sorts of information about you, not just the communications you send, but it may transmit to your apps how quickly you're moving from the accelerometer, how quickly you're accelerating. The gyroscope will say which direction you're moving in. The proximity detector, which is there, so when you put your phone to your ear, it doesn't actually, when your ear presses against the phone, it doesn't actually press buttons and disconnect you or send different messages than you intended. But that same proximity detector can also send other information. The battery sensor, which lets you know how much battery you have left, can also let companies know how much battery you have left. All of those different sensors, which were developed to work on device, are often shipping information off device, and companies use this in different ways. There are patents to check whether two people are in the same proximity by traveling on the same transport. And when they stop traveling on the same transport, perhaps offering to connect them, someone you may know. There are other kinds of uses of the data. Somebody is low on battery. Maybe we should charge them more for a service because they're really desperate for getting that service now. This is data that users are not aware of giving up. In some cases, they can't prevent giving up. In the case of sending an IP-based communication, they can't prevent giving it up. So I'm concerned about that kind of information, which is so far largely not regulated in the United States. The e-privacy directive in Europe may do so. I think we're getting to a point where we're shifting in how we look at privacy in the same way that, for example, the Supreme Court over the period from 1928 to 1967 shifted from looking at communication, which was an ethereal thing, and therefore, because it was wiretapped outside somebody's house, didn't deserve legal protection, to something that did deserve legal protection because the Fourth Amendment protected people, not places. I think we're shifting also on private sector collection. Not immediately, but I expect a shift within the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years. And we will be better protected. Will the data that was leaked out earlier be available? Sure. But all of us change over a period of 10 years. And the products we bought and the things we read are different now than they were 10 years ago. So while it's not great that all this data is out there, it's not a disaster either. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Lydia, just before I invite you, just a reminder to the audience, we do have a Q&A open, and we would love to crowdsource some of the questions. So please do post your questions for the panelists into the Q&A. Lydia.
Hello, this is Lydia Brown. Pronouns are they, them. I'm currently Policy Counsel for Privacy and Data at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and there is my bio in the chat box. You can read more about me. I am a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, wearing a dark colored shirt and blazer, and the pin on my jacket says, "There is no wrong way to have a body." I am also wearing a jade pendant, and behind me is what I describe as one of my fake Zoom mansions. This one has asymmetrical angles, minimalist lines in a mid-century modern style of metal, exposed concrete, wood, and glass, and beyond its windows is a glistening lake and savanna. And I really wish I actually lived in this fake Zoom mansion, but we can just pretend while we're on Zoom that that is where I live and that is where I am. Now, when the question for today's panel was originally posed to me, have we lost the battle for protecting our privacy and data in the name of convenience? I immediately thought of the problem common in many marginalized communities, but particularly in the disability community, of companies and other folks who are perhaps advocating for corporate interests, attempting to advocate for further erosion of privacy protections, at least in the name of promoting greater usability, promoting greater accessibility, especially for disabled people, or in other words, trying to create more inclusive or equitable aims that somehow can only be accomplished if we are to sacrifice or give up our right to some amount of privacy in our interactions and in our use of technology. In the disability community, we call this problem access washing. Access washing is what happens when a developer, a corporation, or perhaps a researcher or policymakers will claim that the purported aim of a new technology or practice is to increase, enhance, or enable disability access, and therefore any ways in which it enables or exacerbates intrusion into one's privacy becomes not just justifiable, but necessary and for this greater good. Another form of access washing that is more insidious, however, is when the ultimate aim of a new product or practice isn't, in fact, primarily to promote disability accessibility, but rather disability accessibility is presented as a possible or likely benefit of this new technology or practice, such that its other aims, its other purposes, and the risks and harms attendant in it should be ignored or should be washed over. So an example of this that has come up in conversation repeatedly over the last couple of years has been around the deployment of increasingly sophisticated facial recognition technologies. Now, you may be familiar with debates from civil rights and civil liberties advocates about the dangers of facial recognition technologies, particularly when they are deployed by law enforcement and in a national security context. Concerns about facial recognition technologies in relation to demonstrated inequities and disparities in their accuracy in reliably identifying people who are not white, male, or cisgender. But the problem with facial recognition technologies in the context of disability access is that facial recognition technologies pose a particularly important access-focused use case, right? That for many people with a range of disabilities, whether that is ocular or neurological blindness, or for people with a range of other neurological conditions that impact facial recognition, the ability to access a possible software program that would enable a person to know who people in their vicinity might be serves a greater purpose even than that advertised to the average presumptively non-disabled person in, say, technologies to recognize who is at your door. for people with certain disabilities, these technologies could ostensibly enable the ability to navigate the world on par with somebody who doesn't have a disability at all, who doesn't have to worry about whether you know or recognize another person around you. But the trouble with facial recognition technologies is that the vast majority of their applications aren't actually being used for accessibility. They're not intended for disabled people's navigation of the world. And where they are, that's functionally an accidental purpose. It's collateral, because the primary purpose and uses of facial recognition technologies have been in corporate, law enforcement, and national security related contexts that are intentionally and by design about not just the collection of data about people on a very mass scale in order to, for example, address training data discrepancies in accuracy rates, but to literally surveil communities with particularly devastating impact for Black and Brown and queer and trans folks, and especially those who are also disabled. So the problem of access washing enters into the conversation when proponents of increasing availability of facial recognition technologies, increasing accuracy of facial recognition technologies, may argue that by deploying more applications for FRT, the world might become more accessible for many disabled people. But in reality, they are not addressing the very real, proven, current risks of harm and actual harm that the use of facial recognition technologies has posed for all marginalized people, including disabled people.
Lydia, thank you very much. So those were the initial pitches from our panelists based around our question: have we lost the battle for data privacy and protection? The panelists we did meet a couple of weeks ago, and we identified some themes, and we've got some initial questions which we're going to explore. But still, if I can invite the audience to post into the Q&A, we'll be happy to address any crowdsourced questions as well. Akira, unfortunately, sorry, there is no certificate of attendance, but anonymous attendee, yes. Where if you're not anonymous as far as giving us your email address, we will definitely be sending out a recording of this webinar later. So thank you for those questions. Please do post some more. Nada, can I come to you first? So we've talked about this idea of have we sacrificed privacy for convenience? Is it, for example, a case that people have become apathetic? We saw on our poll on LinkedIn, 77% thought that 78%, sorry, thought that we'd lost the battle. 22% didn't. The margins were a little bit tighter in the poll that we've just done. But are we apathetic about it? Are people resigned to a world perhaps in which their privacy is already far too compromised to turn the clock back? Do you think?
Sure. I think it is absolutely valid for us to believe that consumers are overwhelmed with the state of privacy and, more importantly, the level of transparency. Laws and regulations commonly require that you disclose what you're processing and why you're processing it. And it can be a mechanical exercise for a lot of organizations. That's why we have privacy notices frequently. There's a good degree of legalese involved, and they're not informative enough beyond what's required by law and regulation. So I think there's a valid case for us, to be putting ourselves in the shoes of a consumer. We are consumers simultaneously when we wear our professional hats and when we don't. I don't know if apathy is the right word, but I think consumers are concerned. I think that there is a displeasure with what they're seeing and the way that data is handled by the organizations that they deal with. And there's a disconnect in terms of the level of information that they're able to access. Yes, it's technically accessible, but is it internalized in a way that somebody feels empowered about the ways that personal data is used and what they can do about it, et cetera. So I don't know that I would characterize it as apathy necessarily, but I think there's so much room for us to be improving the ways that folks understand what processing looks like with the data that they do share, to understand that there's data behind the scenes that's derived, that's inferred, that's aggregated, to understand the reasons why the economic incentives for, when we have free services and free products, we are giving up data, and that data can lead to data points that we never independently shared on our own. So there's a lot in the way of or maybe a lack of awareness. And I think organizations, lawmakers, regulators need to enter into kind of a new era where we're moving away from traditional privacy notices, traditional EULAs, and thinking about more impactful ways to empower folks, even if it's not necessarily in a corporate interest. We need to have the form of law and regulation that requires us to think of innovative ways where we're communicating things. This can't just be a legal exercise anymore. It needs to be something where UX folks are involved, communications professionals are involved, interdisciplinary ways where we're really putting out the message, whether organizations in the private sector want it or not, so that folks feel like they have a grasp on what's happening, and they have, to the extent that there are certain rights in certain jurisdictions, that they feel empowered to use them. That's my take on the apathy piece. I think it's overwhelming, but there are opportunities, I think, for us to be elevating the posture of consumers in an ecosystem where data is moving rapidly, and data we don't know about necessarily is moving just as rapidly.
Thanks, Nada. Susan, same question to you. In your initial pitch, you talked about the fact that the average smartphone has this gyroscope, accelerometer, all of this array of different sensors as well. Is it apathy? Have we made a calculus that we prefer convenience over privacy? Well, what is it about our behavior and our response in terms of privacy?
It's, I would say, rather than apathy, it's lack of choice and it's complexity. If I think about, let me go to first the kind of things I was talking about a little while ago, the data that you supply without being aware of supplying, the data you have no control over supplying. If you were to try and make judgments about whether or not to supply it, for each communication you made, you would have multiple requests. Is it okay to share your IP address? Is it okay to share your packet length? Is it okay to share where the position of your what your accelerometer measure is? A consumer would be overwhelmed within a couple of minutes. It's just not plausible. So when you think about not plausible, then you say we have a wrong model of notice and choice. And if you look at what privacy scholars have been saying for a while now, they've been saying the model of notice and choice, which evolved in the 1970s as a way to protect people on the computer acquisition of data, was in an era not of the internet. It was of large data processing machines and files, things that don't make sense anymore. And so the notice and choice regime is just something that we've been saddled with for 50 years, and it doesn't allow people to make meaningful choices. So I would say rather than apathy, it's complexity, but it's also sometimes the companies make it very hard for you to answer in a way that's reasonable. And of course, we have a business model in which targeted advertising is the way you get free services. Well, it's a devil's choice, and I think that devil's choice has to change.
Thanks, Susan. Noah, I saw you nodding away there. Is it, as Susan said, this access and choice model issue? Or is it apathy? Have we made a calculus that we love the convenience and we're happy to sacrifice data privacy for that?
I would say more the first. I would not consider the current situation to be one of apathy, but I would consider it to be one of resignation. Vast majorities of consumers say that they are ever more concerned about privacy, about how their data is being used. But similarly, huge majorities express a lack of any understanding about what data is collected. I saw Cisco's 2022 Consumer Privacy Survey states that 79% of respondents don't know what data companies are collecting and how they use it. I think that number is probably low. I would say that 99% of consumers have no idea about the amount of data that's being collected. So I think we're really in this strange moment here. We're living in a disconnect where we're ever more conscious of the trade-off we're making. We're not happy about it, but we just have no idea what to do about it. And the answers aren't going to be easy. I think Susan's point about, well, if we give users all this control and we show them the 78 different sensors that they're giving access to for a given app, they're going to have no idea what to do. I absolutely agree with that. I think, you know, there are no easy answers between wanting to not slow innovation, but also wanting to prioritize data privacy, and also being conscious of there is a certain amount of information that we as people are willing to take in about this. And after you pass that moment, we're just getting, you know, more notifications just makes notification blindness, right? Notification fatigue. So I think we're in a moment of resignation, far from apathy, and it's sort of a socio-cultural work in progress, if you ask me.
All right, thanks, thanks, Noah. Just to shift the focus just a little bit. This time last year, January of 22, we actually held our first keynote debate, and we looked at the metaverse. Should we be afraid of the metaverse? I think was the question that we posed. In the session that we held a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the metaverse, Terence, and you know, we talked about its future impact. So if it continues to grow, as many believe, and there's different perspectives on that, but if it continues to grow, you know, what are really the privacy implications for consumers and businesses, Terence?
We're going into a new level of telemetry, you know, being collected. So by telemetry, I mean data points. For example, like, you know, I'm a big geek, so I have a MetaQuest Pro, and you know, this device in itself is a VR headset, but it has cameras that are looking and collecting data points off of my face to mimic those into the metaverse. So my avatar is mimicking, you know, life. And this goes back to, you know, something that I believe Susan was mentioning on, you know, a lot of people probably are going to think about what data is being collected. They're really focused on, like, I'm playing this game, you know, I'm in VR, but you know, where is that data being stored and for what purpose? I mean, if you actually, you know, click through and read the full EULA, it tells you that it's collecting, you know, your biometrics, and you're opting in and giving consent for that data to be collected. You know, we live in a society where I dare to say, you know, everyone that's on this call right now has been a part of some sort of data breach. So our data is already out there. But now we're making another choice to complete the dossier, so to speak, with adding additional contacts and biometric data. And as you've seen, companies are actually building, you know, retail spaces in the metaverse. You know, the likes of Nike and Adidas have, you know, these virtual commerce, e-commerce experiences in the metaverse. So to me, it's like, what's phishing gonna look like in the metaverse? You know, we all are gonna create avatars. Some of them will be in the likeness of our, you know, real selves. Some will be, you know, futuristic, but, you know, what are the authentication protocols, you know, to engage in commerce in the metaverse? Right now, yes, it's a level of friction there. You know, you put in a credit card somewhere, but as we try to make it more seamless, you know, will our avatars, you know, have a way to authenticate in the metaverse? And what if that digital or virtual, you know, identity is compromised on that perspective? And as we move more into, you know, banking in the metaverse and having these more immersive experiences, how will you be able to validate, you know, your friend in the metaverse is the same yesterday and, you know, today and tomorrow? So I just think it presents a new level of complexities that we haven't necessarily begun to solve for. We're thinking about it, but also on the identity and access management perspective, because I do work in cybersecurity. You know, we're really trying to figure out how to make it secure, but also reduce friction. And I believe that's where a lot of the trade-offs for privacy and convenience come in. There are a lot of studies done that say if you add 5 seconds of friction to e-commerce experience, the abandon rate, increases dramatically. So it's almost like we're creating the minimal viable security to get people in, and we're trusting the consumer to increase from the default security perspectives. And I threw out a lot of statistics, but some of those other ones are around, if you think about, there are 80,000 new devices connected to the internet every minute of every day. So data is often said is the new gold, but at the end of the day, when these compromises happen, when you get that notice of your information has been stolen, that's what the attackers are after. And as we generate more data, as we move into the metaverse, data privacy, data security, and I believe consumers, we're going to have to demand more transparency on those practices, and in a more layman's way of understanding it. There's been a lot of proposals around that. I think Apple has done, as Tony mentioned, a pretty good job at privacy, and at least in the app, saying where they were manufactured and what data is being collected. And I think as consumers, we have to demand more of that to really affect change.
Thanks, Terence. Lydia, same question to you. You talked about facial recognition and particularly the implications for marginalized communities. Do you see any risks from the metaverse?
When I have conversations with other disabled people about the metaverse, what I hear most often are fears that existing forms of not just discrimination, but outright harassment leading to hate, leading to violence, will actually be amplified and exacerbated as we develop and move more of our lives into a metaverse type scenario. And that concerns me because when you hear techno optimists speak about the metaverse, usually the conversation is, well, as we move toward the metaverse, that can promote equity. It can put people on more of a level playing field. People have more opportunities to interact and engage with others, and that barriers might be removed. But that conversation is ignoring a couple of really important realities. One, even now, where the metaverse is still largely hypothetical and not widely available or usable for most people, there are huge swaths of the population just in the United States alone who do not have reliable broadband access to begin with. There are huge swaths of the population now who cannot reliably access your average website, with over 98% of websites failing to meet the World Computing Access Guidelines standards for web accessibility. And so when we think about developing this new, exciting sounding technology, we're forgetting that even to be able to have that conversation situates us in a position of privilege, even those of us who experience marginalization. But by having that conversation, we are speaking from a position of privilege, because right now, there are people in this country, let alone globally, right, who do not have access to Web 2.0, let alone to the technologies that would enable participation in a metaverse. But secondarily, these techno-solutionist and techno-optimist approaches to thinking about the metaverse are also elevating a further position of entrenched privilege, which is that of people for whom engaging with others is not already fraught. That of people for whom engaging with others is not already immediately placing those who are the most marginalized at risk of further abuse, of further exploitation, of amplified discrimination, and of attendant and long-term harms. So I'm thinking, for example, right, like even dialing it back, when developers we're launching a whole swath of automated hiring tools to help improve the efficiency of selecting employees and advancing employees through the process, and often would talk about them as a great equalizer, that if we use computer software to make automated assessments of which candidates to advance, we can remove human bias from the process. We can allow candidates to be considered without a potentially subconsciously racist or sexist or ableist HR person making the decision about which resume to advance. But as many have critiqued, rightfully, over the last couple of decades, right? Like people like Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin and Afoma Ajunwa and so many others have rightfully named and critiqued, those technologies have ended up reinforcing and perpetuating not just the existing biases that affect hiring processes, but have accelerated them, have made them worse in some ways, in part by invisibilizing the way that discrimination happens. And so when I think about and have these conversations with others about the metaverse, I want us to invite in a critical perspective too, and not simply to adopt unquestioningly this techno-optimist perspective that a metaverse will be an equalizer, will be a transformative event for the better without any nuance to it. Because while certainly the metaverse may provide a range of opportunities for engagement and building our communities that we don't have now, our existing problems will not disappear. Existing systematic inequities, let alone outright injustices and harm, are not going to go away simply because we have shiny new technologies. And so I want us to really consider carefully whose perspectives we're actually elevating in the conversation and what kinds of technologies we are thinking about developing. Like, who is this actually going to benefit? What issues will this meaningfully solve for people who don't even have access to broadband right now? And that's where our conversation needs to be.
Thanks, Lydia. Tony, if I can just change the emphasis again, just slightly, and detour us to the legalistic aspects of data privacy for the law school audience at the debate here today. Number of you have mentioned these EULAs, or end user license agreement. They're usually extremely long. They are full of legalese that only a small minority of consumers ever read. Now, obviously, you guys, I'm guessing, Tony, I'm guessing you probably read them. But you know, is not reading the EULA, is it damaging our data privacy? What can be done about it?
Well, I think a couple of people have already addressed the EULAs a little bit, and the fact of the matter is they do go unread. The fact that you characterize, Will, that there's a small minority of people that are reading them. I don't even think that's true. I'm not even certain that attorneys, unless they absolutely have to read them, are reading them. And then even those attorneys that are reading them, there's still a lot of confusing language in there. And whether or not you read the EULA, I mean, is, I think this has been addressed already by the group largely, is that you're clicking through anyway, because as a consumer, if you're going to a site, and even if you read the, you're agreeing to all of these things, well, you need to get to that service. So whether or not you read it, whether or not you understand it, whether or not you have a full appreciation of what privacy rights you're giving up, or what you might be, subjecting yourself to, it becomes somewhat inconsequential, I think. So they're very confusing. They're not the same. And so, the fact is, I think that we have to rethink the business model. We have to rethink how we're actually approaching kind of the communication and the education around that. This ties in a little bit. I want to jump back a little bit on the last two questions, simply because I think there's a little bit of a tie in here too. I think when you mentioned, Will, about the whole idea about sacrificing privacy convenience, and I'm not certain that that's necessarily the right question, because I don't think we've ever looked at the internet. I mean, the internet wasn't built on privacy. The internet was built on all about convenience. The internet was built for speed. The internet was built in order to be able to really create this, vast and quick network so that you could communicate fast and quickly. I mean, one of my professors, Professor Schwartz, really emphasized this with us. It just, and when you drill back on the development of, even as we look towards the metaverse and we look towards the the monetization of everything, it's really built for speed. It's built for activity. It's built for commerce. It's built largely to communicate quickly. It's not built with privacy in mind. I don't think until we change the paradigm around and start forcing privacy by design and privacy by default, that we're actually going to see a real shift in how privacy gets approached from the technology perspective. And I think this goes to Lydia's point as well, in that when we start to think about this, not from the surveillance commercialization or the surveillance capitalism side, but when we're actually addressing these needs from a privacy side first, when we think about going into this from a privacy by design and privacy by default, we can start addressing some of the issues, as Susan identified, the plethora list of privacy implications that we give up. So I don't know that it's apathy. I don't know that it's really people giving over necessarily to apathy, but there is a lack of knowledge, and we can start to build now and shift the dynamic so that we're looking at the whole, our environment through a privacy lens as opposed to just a a business lens. So giving consumers a little bit more rights on the front end.
All right, thanks.
I don't know if that goes to if that addresses your EULA question effectively, but the fact of the matter is, I think bottom lining the EULAs, they're nada.
No, I agree. And to the point I was making earlier, this needs to be more than just a legal exercise of articulating what an organization does and doesn't do, because those live in documents that do not resonate with folks. I myself, like other attorneys, I may need to write them from time to time, but I don't in my consumer life really read them. So I think there's a moment we're approaching where we need to be reimagining what our education and awareness strategies are, because the notice and consent model is not going to be sufficient moving forward into the future. And to be fair, I mean, yes, I'm optimistic about the emergence of legal frameworks addressing privacy, but we haven't really interrogated how we communicate in a lot of these laws. We've, required that we disclose more, and that's important, and we need to be transparent, but we're not thinking about like the mechanisms, new innovative ways for reimagining how we elevate awareness and education.
All right, thanks, Nada. Panelists, if we come to you with a different question, but you want to reach back to one of the previous ones and add to it, then feel free. A plea again to folks in the audience to put some questions into the Q&A. Anonymous has a question. Noah, I'll come to you with this one, if I may. How does the culture of privacy start to shift? Many products monetized, selling our data are the same ones that command millions, if not billions of users. How do we shift the window to be focused on privacy as a trade-off to convenience and encourage individuals to make the choice? We've kind of been addressing that all the way along. So I'll add just a little bit of a rider to that one. Is there also a cultural or generational difference in terms of how privacy is approached? Do we see a difference between Gen Z and Gen X, for example? Are there differences, cultural differences in approach across borders, that sort of thing? Noah?
So a lot to unpack there. Education is really key here. My third grader came home last week talking to me about phishing. I thought that was a tremendous victory. This is how the culture changes, is before we have accepted this devil's bargain of convenience for privacy, convenience for security, that we're learning about the choices that we're making before we get to the moment of making them. So I thought that was an incredible victory to see that my kid's local public school is there advancing this sort of education. in terms of generational and cultural differences, for most of us on this call, I think the panelists, most of us have a sense of like, well, my data is already kind of out there, right? And so the generational difference here is that those of us who were brought up kind of before the internet came to be, and then became, professionalized and became adults during the age of the internet, well, we sort of sense it as a lost cause, whereas younger generations don't. But I don't necessarily think that we have reached peak resignation quite yet. When you look at Gen Z and you see some of the things that young people fall into on the internet these days on social media, it's deeply disconcerting. And they clearly have not yet quite figured out the importance of protecting their data and how to do that. So, generationally, yes, there are differences, but I don't think that any generation is quite on the path that it needs to be. Overall, what I see as being a big catalyst in this, how do we actually shift? Well, of course, public opinion is really important. Loud public opinion is important. Voting with our dollars is important, although easier said than done, right? We're trading off every day with so many services that have become integral to our lives. Imagine saying, hey, just stop using your email and tell them I'm not using your email service again until you prioritize my privacy. Fat chance, right? But I think alternatives are what's really going to shift this, right? There are other ways to deal with data that are currently being explored by some organizations and companies, which I think will form the basis for us to be able to shift this. But if we're just relying on people kind of, giving up the convenience that we've gotten and saying no more, I don't think that's going to happen until something better comes along.
Thanks, Noah. Susan, same question to you. Are we seeing cultural generational differences in perspectives on privacy?
I think rather than cultural and generational differences, we're seeing people shifting in how they behave. So if you think about newspaper subscriptions, the New York Times is much harder to get in print. I know, because I like reading it in print, and when I travel, it's getting increasingly more difficult. Starbucks no longer has it. The boxes of newspapers that used to litter city streets are long gone, etc. But digital subscriptions have increased tremendously over this time. This is not just true for the New York Times, it's true for other newspapers, it's true for magazines and so on. So we came to expect various services to be free, with the free heavily in quotes, because as everybody will tell you, all the panelists will say to you, oh, you're the product, it's not free, you're the product, your data is the product. But we came to expect services as free that we are increasingly willing to pay for. Now, there is an economic cause that Lydia will, of course, reasonably and rationally jump on, which is that it's the poor people who are going to get the free services and be tracked, whether it's because they're good for advertising regarding subprime mortgages, or good for advertising because they have diabetes and all these products that would be good for people with diabetes and so on. So we're going to have to put in other kinds of protections so that the poor are not discriminated against and then find themselves in a whirlpool of ads for products that are not actually good for them. But I think we are seeing some shift by the public towards paying for services that originally they had grown accustomed to getting for free. And I think that's a very healthy shift, in fact.
All righty. Thanks, Susan. Lydia, if I can come to you, you talked about some of these free products, and Susan echoed it there. You also spoke very passionately about this idea of access washing, where accessibility dressed up in such a way that it comes at the cost of compromised data privacy and protection. How do we create accessibility for a range of users without that compromise of their privacy and data?
This is Lydia. I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, and this also isn't a situation where only one measure is going to automatically protect people's privacy. but it requires the corporation of not just government entities in creating and enforcing stronger regulation than we have. Like, for example, last year, Congress failing to pass provisions in the ADPPA. And that means that we don't have a comprehensive privacy law right now. We don't. And so right now what we have is a patchwork of regulations that protect only aspects of people's privacy and are woefully insufficient, as we've talked about at length in our discussion today. But, you know, we need actual legislation. We need stronger regulations that result in actual enforcement of the laws that we pass, because simply having something on the books does not guarantee that it is followed. But we also need buy-in from corporations to the extent that they will agree to actually mitigate the kinds of data that they are collecting, to limit what data they collect, to limit how they use it, to limit how they store it, and where they do not, to impose restrictions on what kinds of data companies are allowed to hang on to, how they are able to collect or share that data, how long they can keep it. Because I know that, at least for me as an advocate, I don't trust corporations to usually, if not ever, have the interests of those people who are most marginalized as their number one priority, even though many companies will state that they do have concerns about protecting people's privacy. We know that all the time we witness the impact of not just data breaches, but of the most intimate parts of people's lives being bought, sold, and traded for purposes that they have no idea are even happening, and that can put people at real risk of further discrimination. And that's something that I don't think most people would ever consent to if they knew about it. But we also need to make sure that individual people are also more educated about steps that they can take as well, because while the onus should not be on individual users to have to navigate a confusing Byzantine warren of tools and options, and like we talked about, the never-ending pop-ups that everybody clicks past that say, do you consent? And like, no one's really consenting, but they're clicking a button that says they did, right? People do have the right and should have the tools available to them to understand, if they have the time and inclination, what kind of measures they can take to try to reduce what types of information are collected about them. Again, to the extent that that's possible. And it might not be fully possible for every person. But again, this goes back to systemic issues, right? Like, who has access to what kinds of technologies, who has access to what kind of education, who has access to meaningful choice. And, you know, if the only free products are being offered by very large for-profit technology companies and come with that hidden catch of using the people who are allegedly the beneficiaries of this charity program for further data collection and exploitation, then that's not really a meaningful choice to be able to access that technology or access that device in exchange for being able to participate in an increasingly digital connected world. So there are many moving pieces when we think about the many ways in which and the levels at which people's privacy and autonomy are jeopardized every day already.
Lydia, thank you. Lydia has touched upon it, as have others of you during the course of the debate so far, in terms of business models. And anonymous attendee is asking, you know, what do we think about data collection company credit bureaus like Equifax? Had breaches in 27 and credit information inaccuracy fiasco in 22. They monetize personal data as a business model. What's going to be the future for a company who monetizes personal data in terms of privacy and ESG? And also, Terence, I'll come to you with this then. You know, what are the alternative business models that you know, the current ones sort of based upon, as we've suggested, exploitation, compromised privacy? You know, is it possible to create a model that prioritizes data privacy and protection and promotes user welfare and agency? Terence?
I believe there is. I mean, we're seeing, you know, albeit not in huge swaths, but companies that are beginning to prioritize data privacy, and I believe it was Noah that mentioned, we need viable alternatives. So if you look at messaging apps like Signal or email providers like Proton Mail, or even web browsers like DuckDuckGo that are prioritizing privacy for the consumers, and that privacy by design perspective. But we still have a long ways to go to find, and it sounds bad, but something that's mutually beneficial on both sides, to prioritize privacy and at the same time be a viable business model. I think what Apple single-handedly did to the advertising community when they started the prioritizing privacy on their devices, and having that prompt that I'm sure if you have an iOS device you've seen, where you can opt in, to being tracked. I think that model is something we need to explore more when we think about privacy by design, secure by design. Having the opt-in versus the opt-out model. The concern obviously is for companies that do add advertising and monetize that data. How does that benefit them? And I think that's the question mark that we have to really solve, because the amount of telemetry that we're putting out, and the ability for, going back to something that Susan said, all of the sensors that are on the devices and apps are making use of that. So, I think back as an example, if you have a smart home device like Amazon Echo, you can absolutely disable features on that makes it more secure and private. The issue with that is it also disables some of the functionality you probably bought it for. And again, it's either or and not both at this point. Why can't I have convenience on a device or service that also maximizes my privacy? And I think education is going to lead for us to do more voting with our dollars. And I think that's what is really going to get the attention of businesses and that are in these data collection and practices. The anonymous question around Equifax, that was that's always an interesting, those entities in general, credit collection bureaus. None of us opted in to having any of our data collected, and they have some of our most sensitive data. And I think, the Equifax breach really brought that to the forefront, but it's not a mechanism for us to really opt out, because, these bureaus are collecting and reporting to financial institutions, which is another, you could look at it, another level of surveillance on, what you're spending money on, your employment history. As we go, to some businesses have gone cashless, and again, going back to some of the things that Lydia said, that puts certain populations at a disadvantage that are underbanked, that don't have access to those digital products. So I just think as we evolve into a more digital society and digital transformation is underway, we as the consumers at large have to really start demanding privacy by design, and not in a product that is going to be 40% useful if it's secured. And I think that's the big difference that we really have to demand.
Thanks, Terence. Nada, to continue to explore this idea of business models. Shoshana Zuboff, in her book Surveillance Capitalism, she actually says we're not the product. We're actually the raw material. So is this idea of the current model of exploitation, compromised privacy, is there an alternative out there?
Yeah, I mean, her work on surveillance capitalism really brings to the forefront the economic piece, the economic driver behind the data practices that we see. And our laws and regulations are very much concerned with data practices, handling practices, principles like data minimization, purpose limitation, et cetera. And while those are all incredibly valuable and important, we're not getting to the crux of the matter where we're talking about the appetite in the private sector for data to begin with. And we know, to Noah's point about the cat being out of the bag at this point, there's some truth to that, right? We have an ecosystem that is reliant on data for value, and we see it in the advertising space, we see it in the data brokering space. Ultimately, I don't think we're going to get to a stage that is ideal for consumers until we answer this fundamental question about how much monetization and what degree of incentive will we collectively tolerate for the use of data. I don't know that we have legal regimes that address it pointedly. So again, not to diminish the importance of laws and regulations, because they do create guardrails and they create obligations for organizations to behave in a certain way. We still need to be addressing collectively what it is we'll tolerate in terms of monetization. I don't know that we've done that. It's not reflected in our laws. It's not reflected in our regulations. And all of the things we do to inform, all of the things we do to create choice, until we answer those questions, until we've reached a stage of clarifying what our collective tolerance is, I don't know that we'll be at an optimized state of privacy for individuals and consumers.
Thanks, Nada. So we're down to the last 15 minutes. Just a couple more questions. Tony, if I can come to you, I think it was you who mentioned the idea of sort of privacy education. And I'll talk to a number of the other educators on the panel as well. But what can be done in terms of privacy education? How can we educate the future generations to be more aware of the importance of privacy?
So I think there are a couple of points here too, because I think it's not just about the consumers, and this ties right back to what Nada was just talking about as well, is when we're looking at kind of different business models, part of the education that has to occur is educating business around the data that they are collecting and whether or not they need the data. In my former role, when I was consulting with a lot of our partners, it was about ensuring that and even my own firm, why are we collecting the data that we're collecting? We're so used to getting volumes and volumes and volumes of data just for data's sake, but what do we really need? So whereas we talk about data minimization and we talked about tighter restrictions and to protect sensitive information, when we start to shift the conversation a little bit more towards really what's necessary to get the job done, a lot of businesses just aren't looking at things through that lens. And so I think it's helpful to educate businesses as well. On the consumer side or on the education side for everybody else, one of the things that I think we should be looking at from an education perspective is tying privacy, cybersecurity, all of those elements in with education as we teach technology. They should be hand in glove. When we are actually teaching a new technology, we should be teaching privacy, cybersecurity alongside those environments. And so kids are starting, as young as they are today in the technology space, but I don't think that we're addressing the privacy issues and the cybersecurity issues commensurate with trying to evolve the technology. And I think those can be developed a little bit more effectively. And if I can just real quickly jump back on another point when we talked about culture, because I think culture has an impact here as well too on how we approach education. Culturally in the US, we don't regard privacy the same way they do in the rest of the world. And I think that this is a salient point. The Constitution doesn't mention privacy. We had the whole concept of privacy evolve through case law, with Griswold versus Connecticut and this penumbra and the zone of privacy and everything else. And that's why the Dobbs decision, most recent Dobbs decision has really, called into question how we do and value privacy protections here in the United States, and why this conversation, this is for another webinar in and of itself. But I think that we can't divorce what's happening in the legal arena around privacy and individual privacy rights versus what's happening in writ large on data privacy and how we need to be considering data privacy. So I think, you know, as much as Dobbs was a setback on privacy protection in the US, it has elevated the conversation, both from a personal perspective and a legal perspective, on how we need to be approaching privacy a little bit more. So I think that does tie into how we can work to educate, but I think in order to educate, we have to have a better historical underpinning. You know, privacy is regarded as a fundamental right throughout Europe and throughout the, you know, Australia, New Zealand, and the Caribbean and Latin America. Privacy is not regarded in the law as a fundamental right here in the United States. And I think that's a notable distinction. So.
All righty. Thanks, Tony. Susan, you're an educator. What can be done around privacy education?
So in privacy education, I would completely agree about the idea that we need to integrate privacy into all the technologies we talk about, whether it's machine learning or databases or data science. It's absolutely critical. But I want to take a step back and think a little bit more about what we're really talking about here. We've built an industry in Silicon Valley that operates on using user data. It's a free service that gives you all sorts of stuff, and all it takes is user data to serve you targeted advertising. If we talk about really genuinely protecting privacy, we're talking about changing that industry. And it's complicated, it's expensive, there'll be a lot of objections. And yet, if we want our privacy, and in fact our security, because privacy, the loss of privacy causes a loss of security. If we want that, that's a necessary change. And I think that we're going to see it partially led by Europe because of things like the General Data Protection Regulation. And because many of the companies we're talking about, the largest ones, not the smaller ones, but the largest ones operate internationally, they'll be forced to do changes from Europe. As they do those changes, there becomes an impetus that does allow for a shift, but it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be easy, and there are going to be lots of objections, but that's, I think, the way we need to go. At the same time, of course, we need to do that kind of education. But you can do that education only in the small. You know, how many students do I teach in privacy in the digital age? 30? Over a lifetime, do I teach 6,000? You know, that's not going to make a big difference. So, you know, now if the 6,000 were all the members of Congress and all the state legislators and all the regulators, that would be great, but mostly we don't get to do that. So it's partially as the public becomes more unhappy and as legislators understand more of the costs, we will see shifts. But it's also pressure is going to come from Europe and maybe from other parts of the world, but I think Europe particularly.
All right, thanks, Susan. In the final few minutes, I'm going to put this question to each of you. See this as your takeaway to the audience. I think when we were talking a couple of weeks back, Terence, you talked about your daughter, I think it was, and possibly shielding her and limiting her digital footprint, and perhaps how, you know, that may be in vain because all of these systems imply your existence, even if you've not actually logged onto them. But so is disconnecting the only way to protect yourself from the prying eyes of surveillance society, or are there some more practical things that we can do? Practically, what can we do? What's the practical takeaway you want to give to the audience?
The practical takeaway, I think Susan, really was dead on, but it's really about the education piece. And in a previous role, I was the CISO, and I also was the privacy officer. And one of the things that I did was we built all of our services like they were all subject to GDPR regulations. So regardless of what a system or what data it collected, the minimum security baseline was GDPR. And another thing that we did on the security awareness or education piece, I gamified my security awareness training but also made it available to the family members of the employees. So that did two things: that educated my workforce, but it was gamified. So about 70% of the employees actually invited their children, spouses into that program, and they got the same training that the employees got. So it allowed them to make better decisions. And that's what we're really trying to get to. I don't know if we'll ever get to, utopia's harmonious place on convenience versus privacy. But what we really want to do is have consumers and businesses where, possible, but to make better decisions about, or informed decisions, I would say, applied knowledge is power. So the education piece is paramount on that. And then really, if we have a more educated consumer, they can put pressure on businesses to change their operating model. And I think that's really, how we get there. But in today, the takeaways are, I always say, just be mindful of where you're putting your personal data and for what purpose, and is it really worth the trade-off? Email, that cat's really out of the bag, but there was a popular these avatars you saw popping up everywhere, people uploading photos. Do you really need a cool avatar? Is it worth the trade-off of you uploading 10 photos from your device, and the implications of where are those photos going, and how long are they going to be stored, and how can they be used in a nefarious way? So it's just really making that informed decision. Like, it looks cool, but avoiding FOMO, fear of missing out. Sometimes it's good to miss out.
Thanks, Terence. So same question as well, if I could have you win the 5 minutes remaining, just your quick 1 minute takeaway. Nada, do we disconnect, or is there anything more practical we can do?
I mean, I don't plan to disconnect. I think we're posed with this really impossible question of, the question of how we traded our privacy for convenience. There's not really much of an alternative unless you're opting out entirely of kind of a digital existence. And I don't intend to do that. But to Terence's point, there is something to be done about making decisions about, for me in this moment, do I need this particular application? Do I need this particular service? I think there are some kind of micro decisions we can make in our own lives, whether it makes a dent in the totality or the aggregate level of data about me out there. Who knows? Probably not. But there are kind of smaller things that can at minimum make you feel like you're making a decision, that it's not kind of a digital existence or no digital existence kind of dilemma. So, I don't know how encouraging that is, but at least in my own life, that's kind of the way I think about it. And I too am susceptible to kind of the trivial fun things that exist on the internet. And I've exchanged my data for those fun things, and really kind of sitting with yourself and deciding whether it's worth it or not in the big scheme of things is kind of, that's the personal lens. From a non-personal lens, we've talked a lot about education and awareness. I think, we're seeing conversations about financial literacy emerge. The same needs to exist for digital literacy, and it needs to focus on folks who perhaps are not, as privileged or positioned to be as immediately aware or have access to the privacy information and baseline that they need to make choices and just move through the world with a level of awareness. So I think prioritizing digital literacy for folks who may be marginalized, who don't have that same kind of privilege and access to focus on their own privacy day in and day out is important.
All right, thanks. We are at time. So I would like each of the panelists just to have an opportunity, but just if I could just have you very quick final takeaway. Lydia.
This is Lydia. I think that when we're having conversations about privacy and what we give up for the sake of convenience, I think we need to take a page from disability justice organizers and remind ourselves that we can slow down, that we don't have to rush to be producing new technologies, adopting new technologies, moving faster just for the sake of moving faster. And if we give ourselves more time and space as we develop and deploy new technologies, as we create policies to regulate those technologies, then we're going to be in a better position to be able to more accurately and meaningfully evaluate their impact, their aims, and whether the objectives of developing and implementing those technologies are worthwhile objectives to begin with.
Thanks, Lydia. Noah?
I think right now, if one is really, really serious about their data privacy, yeah, disconnecting is the only real option to protect yourself. That's not a trade-off that I'm willing to make. What I see as something that could change this in the future is having new models, new opportunities, new alternatives. One that I've heard about that I'm particularly interested in is one that's being developed by one of the creators of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee. It's called Inrupt. And this is a company that is creating a solid pod or a personal online data store that would be stored in the cloud, where you are defining what is part of that pod of my data and which organizations, which applications are going to get access to that data. I think as soon as we have more concrete alternatives like that, the pace of education will really accelerate, because then we're educating people about an existent alternative. And I think that the pace of change will also accelerate. Until then, it's disconnect or keep sharing data.
Thanks, Noah. Tony?
Be informed, get educated, know your technology, know how you can disable certain features, avoid listening devices in your home, and advocate for privacy protections.
Thanks, Tony. And finally, Susan.
So I will take what Lydia said and just personalize it and say, be careful about which apps you use. Be careful about which systems you need to be on. Think about whether or not it's worth the trade-off. It's expensive to do. It takes your time, but it's worth it.
All righty. Thank you, Susan. Folks, you've been a fantastic panel. You really have. Informed and interesting. You've helped us to start 2023 with an absolute bang. So thank you. Thank you to Lydia Brown. Thank you, Nada Bazikri. Thank you, Noah Cook-Dubbin. Thank you, Terence Jackson, Susan Landau, and Tony Ogden. Thanks also to Albany Law School for lending us some of your panelists. We do appreciate that, particularly Tom Rosenberger. But also, most of all, thank you very much for the audience for coming along and for listening to this very informed debate. We will be having our next keynote debate in March, and we'll send you some more details shortly. But we're going to be looking at entrepreneurship. Can entrepreneurs solve some of the biggest problems facing the world? Other than that, a very good day to all of you. Thanks so much for coming. Have a good one, and see you soon. Bye-bye.